All right. Good afternoon. My name is Peter Carlson, Chair of Grafton Select Board. This is an emergency meeting the Select Board is holding on July 2nd, 2020. I just have a couple of preliminary ground rules that I have to read pursuant to doing remote meetings. This meeting of the Select Board is being conducted remotely consistent with Governor Baker's executive order on March 12, 2020, due to the current state of emergency in the Commonwealth due to the outbreak of COVID-19 virus. In order to mitigate the transmission of COVID-19 virus, we have advised and directed the Commonwealth to suspend public gatherings. As such, the governor's order suspends the requirement of open meeting law to have all meetings in a publicly accessible physical location. Further, all members of the public bodies are allowed and encouraged to participate remotely. The order, in which you find posted on the town website, allows for public bodies to meet entirely remotely so long as reasonable public access is afforded so that the public can follow along with the deliberations of the meeting. Ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law. This meeting currently will not feature any public comment at this time. For this meeting, for the Select Board, is being conveyed by telephone conference, video conference via the Zoom application as posted on the town website. At this point in time, I would like to identify all members here. So for each one of the Select Board members, please state your name and state in the affirmative that you're present. Mr. Prisby.
Present. Edward Prisby,
Roy, present.
Ms. Roy.
Here.
Mr. Often.
Often present.
Ms. DeFazio.
Fazio, present.
Staff and or consultants who are available. I'm going to go Ms. Kramer. If Ms. Kramer can answer in the affirmative that she's present.
I'm gonna unmute myself. There we go. Jenny Kramer, Town Council. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Ms. LaValle.
Here.
Ms. Meekins.
That is here.
Mr. McInerney.
McInerney here.
Okay. All right. Peter Carlson is present. Okay. So I want to thank everyone for making it such short notice today. We've had some events that have occurred within the past 48 hours that I was asked to hold this emergency meeting to review and discuss the recent developments with the local election. As all of you are aware, there was a press release gone out. If it's okay with the committee, I can read or have the clerk read the press release into the record. And then after the press release, I will open it up for questions and discussions with the town clerk, our town general counsel, and our town administrator. All right. Ms. Roy, do you have a copy of the press release? If you don't, I can.
Sorry, I thought you said you wanted the town clerk to read it. Let me grab it real quick. Okay. All right. On June 30th, our office discovered a box of 202 sealed ballots from Precinct 2 that had been returned to this office prior to the election day, but were inadvertently not brought to the polls and counted. The box has been secured in the vault prior, during, and since the election day, and the ballots remain sealed. Upon discovery of the box, our office contacted Secretary of State Elections Divisions to discuss how we can open and count the ballots and add them to the election results. The state advised us to obtain a court order to allow first count of the ballots. The order will allow us to add those votes to the current figures for that precinct. Today, Town Council has filed the necessary papers with the Worcester Superior Court seeking an emergency court order to allow those votes to be tallied. Once the court issues its order, a small team will be assembled to open ballots and total the counts. The team will consist of the town clerk, election workers, wardens, and the board of registers. For maximum transparency, the opening and counting of these ballots will be televised on local cable access government channels, Verizon Channel 33 and Charter Channel 193. The process will be similar to tallying that occurs at the polls and at the end of the election day. The public is welcome to attend, provided social distancing guidelines can be met. We will publish the date and time when we receive further guidance from the court. Do you want me to continue the time of the facts or?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and do that? Thank you.
Okay. Timeline of facts. On Tuesday, June 30th, 2020, Grafton Assistant Town Clerk Paul Cook was filing forms in the vault in the town clerk's office and discovered a box of secured and sealed unopened early voting ballots, that the town had received prior to election day for precinct 2. The assistant town clerk made the town clerk aware of the unopened ballots. The town clerk inspected the contents of the box and found that it contained 202 early voting ballots for precinct 2. The town clerk spoke with all staff to ascertain how it was that an unopened box had not been counted and determined that the unopened box had been placed on top of boxes of the other boxes while efforts were underway to organize equipment and ballots by precinct for election day. The town clerk contacted the wardens of precinct 2 to notify her that ballots were not processed and the measures would be taken to correct the matter. For this election, the clerk's office had sent out a record 1,855 ballots to voters who requested to vote early or absentee. Returned ballots were stored in the same area of the vault where existing boxes of unused ballots were being held. This caused staff to inadvertently overlook the box of compromised ballots. After the conversation described above, the town clerk contacted the Secretary of State Election Division to alert it that it had discovered unopened ballots and seek guidance regarding having them counted and added to the election results. The Secretary of State advised the town clerk to seek a court order and write a memo explaining the discovery and steps taken to rectify the situation. Going forward, the clerk's office will take the following steps to be sure this does not happen in the future. We will designate 5 sections of our vault for return ballots from each precinct for both early voting and absentee voting. Each of the 5 sections will have color coding boxes denoting early voting and absentee voting to match the precinct they are for. On the morning of election, boxes will be counted for each precinct prior to them leaving the vault and be transported to the precinct to be counted. The boxes will then be counted upon arrival by separate staff to ensure that the same number of boxes counted in the vault arrive at the precinct. We recognize that the integrity of the election is the utmost importance. We will work with town council to find suitable independent organization to investigate and provide a report of the facts of the case to the community. We will implement recommendations from the organization to improve the process in future elections. The clerk's office will hold a press conference at 5 p.m. on Thursday, July 2nd via Zoom to take questions. Questions will be answered through the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar. Information to access the press conference is below.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that, Colleen. So I want to move on to, I want to give Ms. LaValle the floor for a few minutes here to potentially give us any update from the developments that were reported on yesterday to what's going on today. And then after she is done, I was going to allow Ms. Kramer and Mr. McInerney to just address the select board and then open it up to questions and answers from the select board to the supporting parties that are here. Okay, thank you. Ms. LaValle, I'll let you say a few comments and update us.
All right, so this morning we held the first count. We had 4 groups of 2 election workers, and we met in conference room A, and how it worked is they were paired up, so they had a reader and a recorder. They were giving the stack of 50 ballots, and once it turned 11 o'clock, we ended up telling them they could start. So they opened up the ballots. Then they started to read off and tally what the results were. The group that finished first, we ended up letting them, giving them the stack of 2 because there was 202, and they counted those. And then after that, we came back into the office and we have been tallying. The Secretary of State's office said that we would be able to amend and put the amended totals up on the website along with the tally sheets, but we also had to include computer generated ones so they were a little cleaner. So we're currently working on that. But I do have the totals now in my possession and with all the counts added in. And I can read those.
To read into the record the results from this morning. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. So, let's see. So now, do you want me to just read precinct 2 and how it changed, or I mean, I can read totals, and what I'll do is I'll read the border committee, and then I'll read the name and the totals just so you have them, so you'll know. So, Board of Selectmen, Donna Stock ended up with 1,219. Jennifer Thomas ended up with 1,111. Matthew Offen ended up with 2,252. Colleen Roy ended up with 2,055. Then under school committee, Rahul Rathi ended up with 2,538. Oh, I'm sorry, the total. Well, that's what you need. So school committee, Rahul Rathi ended up with 2,500.
Candy, you went on mute. Could you repeat Mr.
I'm
Rothy's
sorry.
figures? That's okay. That's okay. It's Zoom. We're all used to it.
Yeah, Rahul Rathi ended up with 2,538. School committee 1 year, Elizabeth Spinney ended up with 2,429. Planning board 3 year, Linda Hassinger ended up with 2,511. Planning board 1 year, Justin Wood ended up with 2,479. Board of Library Trustees, Karen Duran ended up with 2,341. Martin Essner ended up with 2,135. Town moderator, Daniel Conca ended up with 1,957. Bruce Spinney ended up with 1,356. Housing Authority, Lisa Bravelli Kelly ended up with 2,606. Question 1, which was for the charter change, the yeses were 2,456. The noes were 936. Question 2, which was the override, the yeses were 1,781. The noes were 1,682. And that was all of the ballot.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that update. And I want to just extend the appreciation of getting everyone together today, Ms. LaValle, in the coordination on getting these counted as soon as possible. Is there anything else that you wanted to give an update to before we go into any questions and answers, or before we go into Ms. Kramer or Mr. McInerney, if they have any comments they want to make to the board prior to opening up for questions?
Not that I can think of. I think just everybody worked efficiently. We were, moving along to get it corrected and taking all the steps that we were told to, and being as transparent as possible. And, and that's what I have for right now.
All right, great. Thank you. Ms. Kramer, Mr. McInerney, was there any update that you want to give the board before we go into questions and answers?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I think I expressed the regret that Candy had the day she told me that they discovered the ballots, and we shared that with the board. We shared what steps we would take. Ginny Kramer, who's on the call, did great work to get the documents to the courthouse. It is closed due to COVID. She met the bailiff outside. We got the documents inside. We got a judge to execute the the decision to allow us to count today. At the same time, Candy was pulling together election workers in anticipation of that ruling coming before yesterday afternoon. So to pull it together inside of 24 hours, I feel good that we had that ability, and we have, some dedicated people to want to, as unfortunate as it is that we're in the spot, to pull it together as quickly as we did, and get the results that Candy just read to us, I think is amazing. So I appreciate everyone's effort, but I'm not short-sighted in the fact that we need to take the clerk's recommendation relative to an independent investigation that might yield insight into better procedures the day of the election or even before. And that's Candy's recommendation to us and to the community. And I think we should have that discussion after. I don't know if Jenny wants to add more to that, but I really am grateful that we got through it. We got the results that stayed consistent. And I think that was the goal. So I appreciate everybody's efforts.
Yeah, I would just also state that in dealing with this issue, it's the first one for me. I've been town council for 13 years, and discussing this with the legal counsel to the Massachusetts Secretary of State's Office Elections Division, she let me know that this does happen, to a couple towns every year. And this year, it also happened, I can't remember if it was Dartmouth or North Dartmouth, but fortunately, I know their town council, so I called him and, we figured out together what needed to get filed. And fortunately for us, our Worcester Superior Court acted very expeditiously. He's still waiting for a decision. But again, this is unfortunately something that has happened, and I have asked the state for resources for best practices for handling what is no doubt going to be the increase in mail-in ballots. So to make sure that this doesn't happen again in November or ever. And there are resources out there, so I will share those obviously with Candy and Tim and whoever else would like to see those.
Thank you, Ms. Kramer. I appreciate that update and that insight. So I'm going to open up the questions to the select board. Just keep in mind that there is a press conference via Zoom meeting that Ms. LaValle will be hosting at 5 p.m. today. So I'll open it up to the board with any questions in the discussion, and then we'll go on to the second part of our agenda. Mr. Fazio, and then Mr. Prisby.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to Ms. Kramer, I'm curious of when an independent investigation will begin, and if you know typically how long it'll take to, come back with any sort of results and additional best practices.
Well, I've been in contact with Michelle Tassinari, so I don't have that level of detail yet. What she said was that she would get me the names of a couple of firms. She didn't have that information at her fingertips, so she's going to get back to me with that. And, I think that generally, from what I know about investigations generally, which are usually take place in the employment context, so I don't know how different this is. There'll be an independent law firm called in that has no relationship with anybody, and and just interview people and come to conclusions. So I can't really put a time frame on it. This doesn't seem to be factually complicated, so I wouldn't anticipate it would take a lengthy period of time. But I guess it really would be up to whoever the investigator is.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Kramer. Mr. Prisby.
Thank you, Mr. Carlson. I actually have a couple questions, but in keeping with that topic, and I guess this goes to Ginny or Tim or Candy, I'd be curious as to your input. I've never seen an investigation like this take place, so I'm wondering about the mechanics of it. And I know that, look, this isn't just about the 202 ballots. This is about the public's confidence in the electoral system. I'm glad that we met today. I think it was important to do this and to show the public that we are taking this seriously and we're providing leadership on this issue. And on that, I'm wondering about the independent investigation. Is that something that is Candy's office retaining the investigator and paying for the investigator? Is our office doing it? Who's reaching out to the investigator? Who is the investigator going to be coordinating with? I appreciate that, obviously Candy's been upfront about this. If she wasn't, if she was somebody different or somebody with less integrity, we might not have ever heard of the box of 202 ballot votes. So thank you, Candy, for being upfront about that. But I am wondering if it's best if her office oversees this, or is it best if our office oversees this?
I would recommend that the board, through Ginny Kramer, coordinate the investigation.
I would agree with that. Okay, that makes me feel a little bit better. I'll rest. I've got a couple more, but I'll let someone else go.
Thank you, Mr. Prisby. Ms. Roy, I believe you had your hand up next.
So yesterday I actually did reach out to an attorney who specializes in election audits to ask some of those questions about how long the time frame might work. And they were saying that it really does depend on what they identify through the investigation. And there can be two types of investigations: an investigation that's going to go through the process of what happened, and an investigation that goes through the personnel. So just to be clear, we're all looking to do an investigation that goes through the process, correct? And if something was to be uncovered, then we'll deal with that as that happens. But that's just my understanding. And then she did mention something to me about an absentee ballot disposition list. And I was wondering, Candy, if you could tell me a little bit more about that, tracking the absentee ballots when they go out, when they come in, and if there was any issues or red flags we could have seen earlier before we found the box.
So I'll just bring you through the steps, that I can tell you. So we mailed out the mailer, and, allowing any person who is a registered voter to fill out the form. So as we started to get those in, what our office does, and we allowed people to mail them, they could drop off in the gold box, or they could send via email. So what we did is when we get them in, we timestamp them in. And I'll break this down into a couple ways. So if we get them through the mail or the drop box, what we're doing is we're stamping them in. We're entering them into the state computer, and then we're also, we keep another spreadsheet in office, an Excel spreadsheet that we're tracking as well, to ensure, that and that's what the number is when it's on there, so we know, how many ballots are going out. If they're coming via email, then we're doing the same thing. We're printing them out, we're stamping them in, but we were sending a response, email, just letting people know, yes, we received your ballot, you're all set. And that was getting sent after we had prepared their ballot and it was in the envelope ready to be mailed. So that way we knew if we went back and had an email that, we had the actual ballot in front of us and we were responding, so that way we couldn't miss it. So that's what we have here. Then, from there they mailed out. We start getting them in. If they come in again through the Dropbox or mail, we have to stamp them in, enter them into the state computer, then we enter them into this Excel spreadsheet, and that's where we store them in the vault. From there, on the week before the election, a few days before the election, depending on how many you have, we do sort them by precinct. And, in this case, because we had so many, that we were using boxes that we currently had empty in the vault that had the ballots in them. And, and I think that's, again, what happened is we were using that to sort them. And then they get brought to the polls on election day. You also have to understand that we do have some that come in throughout the day on election day because they are allowed to submit those up until the close of polls. So the initial batch that we get before the election, they do go down to the polls and they process them there. And then the ones that come throughout the day, our office has to do the same process, and then we bring it down to them to enter in sporadically throughout the day up until 8 o'clock when we check the gold box or, wherever, and they do that. So did that answer everything, I think?
For now, I'll see what other questions people might have. Thank you.
Mr. Austin, then Mr. Prisby.
Yes, Mr. Carlson, through you to Candy. So as the ballots are coming in, we're recording them, we're putting them in an Excel spreadsheet. Is there any process to compare the numbers? Because it seems like at the end of the day, you've recorded the amount that have come in and the amount that have been processed. Is there a check there that we can implement to make sure that we've just compared the totals to, regardless of what box it's in or what safe it's in or whatever, that we know that there's a gap there to just make sure that everyone's been processed that we've received?
I guess it's something further we can try to implement. Like I said, that's usually our steps is once we enter it into the state computer and then our computer, we put it in the vault until election day. It is kind of an antiquated process if you think about it, how many times we're touching paper or the ballot. So yeah, I think that's something, and that's one of the things, that's on my list of observations I've made this past election and during this whole COVID-19, and our office having to process them. I've made notes and whatnot, but I guess we can discuss that. I do want to say, just to put out there, that there is some pending legislation with the state that hasn't passed yet. So there may be things that we implement or discuss, but until we know, finally what other things we have to, now adhere to, that may change. So one of the things is to, instead of having ballots go into envelopes, people are going to be able to process them through the tabulator. And then, we would count those on election day. So that's not set in stone, that's pending, but, that's going to help with, the processing of these as well.
Thank you.
Mr. Prisby.
I think I had a similar question. I want to make sure if I'm hearing you correctly. So you send out an absentee ballot that's recorded, that it's been sent out to Joe Smith, who lives on Danielle Drive. Joe Smith, who lives on Danielle Drive, sends it back, and you record again that that ballot has been returned. And you get, so if you send out 1,000 of these and 800 of them come back, you have recorded, number one, that you sent out 1,000, and number two, that 800 have come back, right? Okay. So as of election day, then you would know that there were 800 mail-in ballots somewhere in your office. And I have a question about that I'll come back to in a second. And then also on election day, you have 2,000 people that show up to the polls and they all vote. So when the polls close, you would know that 2,800 total votes had been cast, right? Okay. So my question is, if we have here a situation where there were only 2,600 totaled, indicating a winner on the ballot question and in the select board races and the school committee race, how is it that we didn't pick up that there were 200 and something votes that hadn't been counted?
So I can honestly tell you with this election, this was a tough one. And as you know, I mentioned we had a skeleton crew. We ended up having to get a waiver from the state along with other towns because we just did not have the workers that were available to work. We ended up appointing 9 people. So, and the requirement was that if we had a waiver, we had to have at least 1 warden and 1 clerk available at the polling place. So this particular precinct, the warden was actually in charge of 2 precincts, 2 and 3 together. She didn't have the staff she usually, works with. And I think a little bit of the mix too is that we had some of the newer people who, I hate to say it, but we kind of threw in there with minimal training, helping with this, that I think it just, honestly, it was an oversight as well. And I don't know what else more to say on that, unfortunately, right at the moment.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else have any other questions? Mr. Fazio, was there anything else that you wanted? I didn't know if your hand went up. Okay. All right, Mr. Often?
No, nothing for me. I'll look forward to, I think the public, I'm sure, will have some questions in the Q&A, and, I'm not sure necessarily that we need to cover these things twice. Just a general comment that I agree with what Mr. Prisby had said earlier, that, this is as much about making sure that people feel confident in, every type of voting opportunity that they have in the upcoming elections as much as it is about what happened. And I just want to also articulate that I want to thank Candy for you being so forthright and just transparent about the whole process. I really appreciate that. That inspires me with a lot of confidence personally that you are taking this process and our elections in general in a very serious way.
Okay. Ms. White, you said you may have a couple more questions when you asked originally. I just want to make sure you had a chance to ask what you had and before we move on to the next agenda item.
Yep, this one's just a little bit different. So in the event that somebody wanted to request a recount, because I have had people ask me that, there is a deadline, right? It's 10 days after. Does that deadline now start today, or is that deadline starting still from June 23rd?
So I actually, I honestly have to call the state to confirm that because I want to make sure that's right. So I don't have that answer right now.
Okay.
But I can definitely have that for later today.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay.
Great. Any other questions? Before we get on here, I knew I was gonna, not allow Q&A because this is really just a discussion between us and the clerk's office and the parties involved with getting this through to today. But with the committee's permission, I would like to just read a few of the questions. And I know, Candy, you're going to be having your press release later on. So if you don't have exact answers to these questions, maybe these are things that you can address at 5 p.m. Okay. First one up was from Nancy. Who stamps them in? And is this usually a one or two multi-person task? How do you know how do you know the boxes are emptied daily? So I think she's referring to the boxes outside the municipal center. And so who stamps them in? Is it a one or two person task? And how do you know when the boxes are empty daily?
So I can address most of that. So I will tell you, as with everything this year, not just us, the whole world has tried to implement procedures because of COVID-19. And that's, no different here. So we use resources that we had to, to get through this election. And the gold box out front was the only secure, place that people could put the ballot. And it's generally, the keys are under lock with the Treasurer's Department. So they actually empty that several times a day. So they would empty it and then bring us the ballots to our office. And then from there, we stamp them in depending on how many it is. There could be a couple of us that are stamping them in, one opening, one stamping. So it all depends. It can be a one-person, two-person job depending on how many come in. So that is one of the things that, we noticed that that box was not made to, put this size envelope in. So it was the best thing that we had. We know we have to address that and come up with a better system for September. And it has already been mentioned. And I think for Town Hall in general, many of us will get use out of a bigger box. So it is something we are looking into.
Ms. LaValle, I think Michelle Rush had a similar questions about the observations of the boxes overflowing outside. I think you answered what will be done in the future to ensure drop boxes are not overflowing. Did you want to just update that with the same answer?
So what I can tell you, a couple things that we found, we ended up asking that the key be left in a central location for our office and theirs, so I could go out when they were not there. And we found that people were putting them in vertically versus horizontally, and it was jamming the inside, and then people would just leave them in there. So that is how that happened. And so when you'd go out and empty it at first, you'd be like, there's nothing in here, but they would be jammed up in the top from the way they were inserted. So we figured that out, and we just ended up going out more often and checking it after we discovered what was happening.
Thank you. And last but not least, and this will be the last question before we move on to the next agenda item. Marilyn, I don't have a last name. It felt like you did not answer Ed's question about realizing number of votes did not match. Did you want to address that one more time, or did you feel that you've addressed that sufficiently with Mr. Prisby?
I feel right now, for the facts that we know, and everything that, was addressed, or, the way the whole election went, that is honestly, what I have at the moment is for an answer. Like I said, we looked into it. We're correcting the counts now. This might be something we have to address more going forward to get further steps if that's the case. But I mean, right now, like I said, I'm listening to, we had people that aren't usually there. It was a tough day. It was, short staffed. And unfortunately, it got by, our office, three of us, that the box was sitting there, and, she tried the best she could. So, I mean, I honestly don't have anything else to say right at the moment on that.
All right, appreciate that. Thanks for taking that time and answering those questions from the public. I'm sure you'll be getting some similar ones at 5 p.m. So without any further questions, let's move into the second part of our agenda. And let's discuss, discuss whether or not, we want to initiate a formal investigation. And I want to say maybe investigation is the wrong word. Maybe this is a fact finding with someone who can provide an outside recommendations to assist our clerk's office in the town to assure that, process that are evaluated and, go forward, and then what recommendations can be made to make them better. So I know we use the word investigation, but, keep in mind it, it doesn't have to be, to like Ms. Kramer's point of view, like, an investigation into an employee. It's basically a fact finding into the situation, all the people involved, and then how to make it better. So, so that was on me putting that on the agenda. So, anyway, I'll open it up to discussion about what the board wishes to do going further based on Mr. McInerney's recommendation earlier during comments. Mr. Frisbee.
Thank you, Mr. Carlson. I think if there is a silver lining here, I think it's this, that during this pandemic, we know a few things. Number one, that we know Candy LaValle is an honest broker, right? I mean, she did come forward with this. And I commend you for your honesty and your transparency here. And number two, that this happened, it was discovered, and at the end of the day, it didn't change any of the results of what had happened a week before. And number three, we know where our fault lines are now. We know that, we know that due to this pandemic, we're going to get more absentee and mail-in ballots. And we know that we need to do a better job of cross-referencing what comes in and what the total is with the actual total, so that this doesn't happen again. And again, Candy, I thank you for your suggestions in your press release yesterday with what more you can do for the storage of these boxes. I do think that we need to move that the TA work with Ms. Kramer to find someone to come in and further outline for us the important steps that we can take to ensure that this never happens again. This can be treated as a learning experience. We can move on and hopefully ensure Grafton voters that come September, and then again come November, that each and every one of their votes is going to be securely counted. That we're going to take care of any issues that we have with the boxes that they're left in. And we're going to be able to work with the post office locally to make sure that they're effectively communicating with the public when their mail-in ballot should be sent in. Obviously, again, to the public, use common sense, like don't mail it the day before the election. So I think this, whatever you want to call it, investigation, or having somebody come in, show us our fault lines and make recommendations for improvements would be, we would be well served by that.
Ms. Roy, thank you.
If I could just make a recommendation to Ms. Kramer and Mr. McInerney to reach out to Lauren Goldberg at KP Law. I think the term we're looking for is an election audit, and that's one of her specialties. And she works really closely with the town clerk's office and the registrator. It's not a gotcha moment. It's to just analyze the process, find the weak spots, come up with new processes if we need those. And I think that would be beneficial if we could reach out to her, please.
I know Lauren very well.
Awesome.
I'm happy to do that.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, anybody else? Mr. Often?
Yeah, Mr. Carlson, I think just another sort of general recommendation. My observations on both the town meeting and also the election, kind of, compare and contrast between those two events. It seemed like we had significant coordination of volunteer in both circumstances to facilitate both of those events. I would urge the town, I guess, to try to get ahead of that a little bit more in the upcoming election in November to make sure that, the common theme in a lot of Candy's comments were that we were short-staffed. So let's make sure that we are fully supporting the upcoming election and elections. with the amount of volunteers that are, reasonable to get. And I think for us, that means trying to get ahead of that as much as we can and ensuring that we have all of the requisite staffing that we need to support the event. Thank you.
Anybody else? Mr. Fazio, anything? Nope.
No, everybody else covered what I would have said. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to add, I would agree with Ms. Roy's assessment about, this being more of an election audit in the process. I do agree with everyone else's comments. And I think one of the things is going to be very important for the public is that this be disclosed once these findings are made available. And potentially maybe, Ms. LaValle, you having another meeting like the one you're going to be hosting this afternoon, maybe answer questions. And once that report's made available, walk people through that process too. I think that'll be, to Mr. Prisby's point, walking people through how the process has changed and how you're making these recommendations and changing to a system that you said it's very archaic. It's something that's just been going on not only in Grafton but other communities for years. And this situation here is proven that your foresight in making changes to the process to assure these types of mishaps don't occur again, I think would be reassuring to the public and demonstrate your ability to run that office and run those elections to those expectations. So I would just recommend that you do make that become made available to the public as soon as it's ready. Other than that, I have no more comments. Does anyone like to make a motion?
Chair,
Mr. Prisby.
I move that we direct the town administrator to work with town council to initiate an investigation into this incident, and further that the investigator make recommendations to us about how to avoid future ballot incidents.
Second.
I have a motion made. Second. Any discussion on the motion? All right. Hearing none, we'll do this through roll call vote, but this time I will call your name and you will say aye or nay. Mr. Prisby.
Aye.
Mr. Often.
Often aye.
Ms. Roy.
Roy, aye.
Mr. Fazio.
Fazio, aye.
Mr. Carlson says aye. I declare the motion carried unanimously, 5-0. Mr. McInerney, you have our direction. Please keep us updated as to the progress, and I would hope that maybe we get a couple of quotes for this too in the short amount of time that we can do this, and make a recommendation to the board on which contract that we would need to sign at a future meeting.
I can do that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, guys, if there isn't anything else, I want to thank everybody for making this on such short time. I want to thank Ms. Kramer, Ms. LaValle, thank you very much, Ms. Meekins, and Mr. McInerney. Appreciate you setting this all up on such short notice. And I want to thank the public too for participating and keeping an interest in our electoral process. Please tune in at 5 p.m. To Ms. LaValle's press conference, and she will be more than happy to answer all of your questions and probably review in more detail if you request it at that time. And that's all I have. I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I need someone to actually say the motion, please. Thank you.
Move we adjourn.
Second.
I have a motion made and seconded. All those in favor by roll call when I call your name, Prisby?
Thank you, guys.
Mr. Often?
Often aye.
Ms. Roy?
Roy, aye.
Mr. Fazio?
Fazio, aye.
Mr. Carlson, aye. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a safe and wonderful, happy 4th of July weekend. We will see you all next Tuesday. Thank you.
Happy 4th.